Welcome back to another installment of Unknown Military History. I am your host, Anthony Tran, and this is the start of a brand new series which tells the story of what is arguably one of the most important conflicts of the 20th century, often overshadowed by the turbulent world wars and revolutions of the era. While at first glance, the Polish-Soviet War might seem like a side conflict, which was part of a larger theater in the Russian Civil War, the Polish-Soviet War arguably stands out as one of the important but overlooked theaters of conflict. So without further ado, let us begin. For centuries, there have been nations which stood at the crossroads of history. For example, Armenia was a battleground between the Roman Empire and its Persian rival. However, in the perspective of Europe, it can be argued that the land which would become Poland was an example of one of these types of nations. In medieval times, Poland was not a country, but was instead part of the Kievan Rus, a large coalition of early Slavic and Russian kingdoms which vied for dominance in the region. In the aftermath of the Mongol invasions of the Kievan Rus, these lands were subject to various Khans for centuries before the collapse of the Mongol Empire led to independence for these peoples. As the centuries progressed, Poland would develop into its own kingdom before it merged with a neighboring kingdom, Lithuania, into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This powerful state dominated Eastern Europe, often fighting alongside and against other powers. Over time, a strong identity grew amongst the Poles, but unfortunately, their autonomy would be hindered soon. By the 17th century, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had become weakened by costly wars, as well as major uprisings in their own country. After suffering defeats against major powers such as the Russian Empire and the Austrian Empire, what was the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth ended up being partitioned. Despite this, Polish aristocrats and leaders still governed in their territories, albeit under the guise of their new overlords. Yet there were many Poles who desired to have their own nation independent from Russian or Austrian rule, which we shall soon see. Now, we must turn to Russia. Since the medieval era, Russia had been seen as an unimportant backwater nation on the edge of Eastern Europe. Despite throwing off the Mongol yoke, Russia was far from the power that it would become. Throughout the centuries after its unification under Ivan III, Russia had begun to flex its newfound strength. The Russians began to expand eastwards, gradually swallowing up Siberia and subjugating the Central Asian kingdoms. As Russia expanded, it inevitably found itself in wars against powerful foes. Recognizing the need for modernizing Russia if it wanted to keep up with Western powers, Tsar Peter the Great had embarked on a series of reforms in the 17th century. One of the high points of Peter the Great's reign was his victory in the Great Northern War against the Swedish Empire, a war which solidified Russia as the most powerful state in the East. However, despite Russia's rise to prominence, the late 1800s and early 1900s would bring about a number of calamities, which would bring the bear down. The first major event which shook Russia was the Crimean War, from 1853 to 1856. This war was caused by several things. First, the Ottoman Empire had begun to decline, while at the same time Russia, under Tsar Nicholas I, was expanding and eyeing Ottoman territories. In addition, Russia claimed to be the protectors of Orthodox Christians within the Ottoman realm, justifying its reasons for wanting to go to war against the Ottomans. When looking at the players, it would seem as if Russia had the advantage in this war. However, the Ottoman Empire was soon joined by France and the United Kingdom, who feared that increasing Russian influence in the region would threaten their interests. In the ensuing Crimean War, Russia was defeated, and the war was significant because many consider it to be the first truly modern war alongside the American Civil War, in which modern technology and brutality was used to its finest. The defeat of Russia in the Crimean War weakened its military and its economy, as well as its influence on the world stage. Recognizing its weakness, the Russian czars drew up plans to modernize the country. When Russia finally began to industrialize, it was way behind that of Western Europe and the United States. This rapid industrialization nearly doubled the population of Russians in major cities such as St. Petersburg and Moscow, and this actually made the living conditions even worse than before due to overcrowding. Russian industrial workers were often paid very little and were tied to the land which they lived, meaning they were little more than serfs. In addition, the overcrowding caused food shortages and famines. One famine in Russia was estimated to have killed 400,000 people. Thus, when Tsar Nicholas II came to power in Russia, he was at the forefront of an empire which threatened to crumble. Previous Tsars had began the process of democratization in Russia by giving the Russian parliament, or the Duma, major roles in economic and political reforms to help the country. However, Nicholas II resisted the Duma, undermining the progress that had been made. Meanwhile, on the diplomatic front, Nicholas saw a number of successes. He helped to sign the Anglo-Russian Convention, ending the hostility between Russia and the British Empire over influence in the Middle East. In addition, Nicholas's decisions helped to counter the strength of a rising power in Europe, Germany. Nicholas II also strengthened the alliance between Russia and France to counter threats from Germany and Austria-Hungary. Nicholas II would also propose the Hague Convention. While this was unsuccessful, it helped to lay the groundwork for modern international laws, which include things such as war crimes. However, despite success on the diplomatic front, Nicholas II began to face setbacks on the home front, as the people of Russia were still struggling on a daily basis. For example, when peasants began protesting for more food and better conditions, Nicholas II's soldiers felt threatened by the mob and fired on the crowd. Though Nicholas II wasn't present at the time, he received the blame and the hate, and this event, known as Bloody Sunday, was one of the many violent incidents which plagued Russia at the time and threatened to boil over into revolution. This would happen, and in 1905, angry workers began a series of strikes across the nation, and during the course of these strikes, worker-dominated councils known as Soviets would form. Trying to undo these setbacks, Nicholas II went to war against Japan due to a dispute over border agreements in Manchuria. The Russo-Japanese War was a disaster for Nicholas II, as his fleet was wiped out during the Battle of Tsushima. Russia lost influence in Asia and was humiliated on the world stage by an Asiatic power. However, after the 1905 war against Japan, Nicholas II doubled down and began to allow his advisors and the Duma to help him manage the empire. Through the years, Nicholas II began to make progress, and the old catastrophes of the past slowly became more or less forgotten. However, despite this, the quality of life for the average citizen in Russia was still horrid. And looking at the democracies of the West, many Russians couldn't help but wonder if there was a better system. While some looked to democracies, others looked to new political systems such as socialism and communism, which was ultimately inspired by a philosopher named Karl Marx. Marx stated that within a state, there should not be different levels of wealth and that all classes live equally in a utopia. And he stated that there would come a day in which the working class, or the proletariat, would rise up and overthrow the ruling classes, or the bourgeoisie, and bring about a socialist utopia. Although this sounded nice to many on paper at the time, the reality would soon hit them. In the year 1914, long-standing tensions in Europe would erupt into World War I. Following the assassination of the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand by a Serbian terrorist, the Austro-Hungarian Empire declared war on Serbia. Germany followed suit, siding with their ally Russia, bound by its alliance with Serbia, joined in, and France declared war not long after. When the Germans invaded a neutral Belgium in order to flank France, Britain joined the Entente against the Central Powers. Nicholas II began mobilizing the Russian army into a war that would end all wars. World War I began badly for Russia, as they faced a major defeat against German forces under Hindenburg and Ludendorff at the Battle of Tannenberg. The Russian commander Samsonov committed suicide, and this defeat was a sign for Russia that the war would not be an easy victory. Luckily for Russia, the Germans had to withdraw reinforcements from the Western Front to fight at Tannenberg, which allowed France to fight another day alongside Russia and Britain. Over the 1915 to 1916 campaigns on the Eastern Front against Germany and Austria-Hungary, Russia continued to suffer massive defeats and territorial losses. Due to Russia's weak industry compared to that of the Germans or the Western powers, Russian soldiers were often short on rations and weapons. Morale in the Russian army was low, despite Tsar Nicholas II's efforts to boost them. However, during July 1916, Russia was able to turn the tide in the east. Under the leadership of Russian commander Alexei Brusilov, the Russian forces took advantage of weakened spots in the enemy line and launched a major assault. Over the so-called Brusilov offensive, the Austro-Hungarian army was shattered, losing over 800,000 men. However, despite this being a victory for Russia, it was a Pyrrhic one at best. Russia lost over 500,000 men, crippling the power of the Imperial Army. The heavy toll which the Brusilov offensive had on the Russian military ended up hurting Russia more than helping it, as the morale of soldiers reached an all-time low due to the heavy casualties and lost supplies. In addition, the Russian people also had to bear the brunt of it, as they too suffered from shortages sent to the military. Thus, in 1917, the February Revolution would take place. Tired of war, an unpopular czar, food shortages, and bad working conditions, huge crowds of strikers took to the streets. Unlike the revolution in 1905, this was much bigger. The police and the military were unable to put down these riots, even as some regiments resorted to violence. Revolutionary activity would last around 8 days, and eventually, on February 27th, the garrison in the capital city of Petrograd sided with the revolutionaries. And only 3 days later, Tsar Nicholas II would be forced to abdicate, ending centuries of Romanov rule in Russia. In order to replace the Tsar, the liberal and socialist revolutionaries set up a provisional government under the Prince Georgy Lvov. However, this provisional government was unpopular, and in July, Alexander Kerensky, the head of the Socialist Revolutionary Party, became the head of government. It was Kerensky who had helped with orchestrating many of the events which led to the downfall of the Tsar and the February Revolution. However, Alexander Kerensky, who was also the Minister of War at the time, was unable to fix Russia's problems upon assuming the head of government. Food shortages, unrest, and mass unemployment were still at large, and most importantly, Russia was still embroiled in World War I and taking heavy losses to advancing German forces. It was thus that later, that October, another revolution, known as the October Revolution, would break out in Petrograd. Vladimir Lenin, a firm believer in communism who had advocated for a proletarian revolution against the ruling classes in Europe, had been in exile in Western Europe for around a decade. However, he had kept up with the unrest and directly supported efforts by his fellow communists to take power in the government. And now that Russia was on the edge of collapse, Lenin had his opportunity. The Russian Empire, or the German Empire, which wanted to end the war on the Eastern Front, in order to shift their attention westward, sent Lenin back to Russia in the hopes that he and his Bolshevik followers would cause turmoil in Russia. When Lenin arrived at the Bolshevik Central Committee, he persuaded them to nearly unanimously vote for a resolution which stated that an armed uprising is inevitable, and that the time for it is truly ripe. Lenin expressed the need for this to happen in order to achieve true communism in Russia, and was confident that the insurrection would be successful. For months, the Bolsheviks had secretly been biding their time, building influence and power in major cities throughout Western Russia. After this, the Bolsheviks created a revolutionary military committee within the Petrograd Soviet led by Leon Trotsky. Leon Trotsky was a close friend and supporter of Lenin, and he had also been exiled to the West just like Lenin. Originally a Menshevik, he had joined the Bolsheviks under Lenin, and Trotsky would soon become the head of Lenin's planned Red Army and a major official within the Soviet. The Bolsheviks under Lenin and his supporters managed to occupy a number of government and strategic locations in Petrograd and declared a new government with Lenin at its head, and Lenin would become the first communist leader in history. The Bolshevik coup would lead to civil war within Russia. The Russian Civil War is a very complicated matter, but it can be narrowed down to a struggle between two factions, the Reds, or the Bolsheviks, and the Whites, anti-communist Russians, under Kerensky, and various unaligned independence movements. With civil war breaking out in Russia, Germany, and the Bolsheviks under Lenin signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, in which Russia would lose much of its western holdings, such as Belarus, the Baltics, Poland, and Ukraine. As Russia sank into civil war, which we are not going to be discussing in depth due to the fact that this series focuses on the Polish-Soviet War, newly emergent countries in the West were granted autonomy. Despite the fact that these newly emergent countries were puppets of the Kaiser in Germany, the defeat of Germany and the Treaty of Versailles in 1918 left these nations free to do their own thing. One of these nations was Poland, which stood at the crossroads of its warring Hungarian, Romanian, and Czech neighbors to the south and the Bolsheviks to the west. Poland was established in the aftermath of the Greater Poland Uprising in 1918 against Germany, and was finally an independent state after 123 years of rule by its powerful neighbors. Poland would come under the de facto control of Marshal Józef Pilsudski. Pilsudski had been a Polish-Lithuanian-born commander and had fought in World War I under the banner of Austria-Hungary. He would become Poland's chief of state starting November 1918, when Poland regained its independence. Pilsudski envisioned a Polish-led federation of nations, which included Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Ukraine, and the Baltic nations. He set out to secure vast territories in the east. Under the leadership of Pilsudski, the new nation of Poland achieved victories in a short war against Ukraine and one against Lithuania. Meanwhile, in Russia, Lenin's Red Army was winning major victories against the white opposition forces in Siberia. Both Lenin and Trotsky would begin to see the future of the communist revolution as one not just within Russia itself, but also throughout Europe, in order to achieve a worldwide proletarian victory. Since the Bolsheviks had effectively taken over Russia and established a new Soviet state, Lenin turned his eyes westward. This was also in part due to communist unrest and rebellions within a weakened Germany, which had suffered much due to World War I and the Treaty of Versailles. Lenin and his supporters viewed Poland as a gate which would open communism to the rest of Europe and eventually the world, and thus they made ready for war. And I hope you enjoyed this episode about the causes and the long-term origins of the Polish-Soviet War of 1920, and as always, see you in the next one.